Our ability to measure the global rise in concentrations of greenhouse gases helps us understand the critical problem of climate change and its causes. Thanks to advances in science and technology, we can now use atmospheric monitoring to map a clearer picture of greenhouse gas concentrations, from the national level right down to individual cities. Cities and megacities are densely packed with sources of greenhouse gases, from industry to housing to transport and energy production. It's no surprise that they account for 70% of global emissions. Today, we have the tools to map in greater detail a city's greenhouse gas sources and sinks. First, high-resolution monitoring is achieved through networks of instruments on tall towers, satellites, and aircraft to provide a detailed picture of greenhouse gas concentrations. These data are then integrated with meteorological information such as wind and rain patterns, making it possible to work backwards to model the origin and spread of emissions from different sources. The same approach can be used for monitoring pollution and air quality. With this crucial information at their disposal, urban decision makers can identify the main sources of GHG emissions, target the sources that are priorities for reductions, and design their citywide emissions policies and strategies. These new tools and technologies can help your city and others around the world to become a critical part of the climate solution.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the World Wildlife Fund, WWF, and the World Meteorological Organization, as well as the Global Atmosphere Watch Program, I welcome you on this exciting webinar series for cities committed to a healthy urban life. My name is Tabaré Arroyo Currás, and I have the great pleasure of serving you as host in this third and last webinar. This is the third and last webinar of the series of 3 webinars, and I'm happy to also introduce my colleague from the World Meteorological Organization, Mario Peiro Espi. Today we will talk about carbon neutral cities. We will gain knowledge on how atmospheric observations can support mitigation actions on the path towards carbon neutral cities. Before we jump into the matter of this webinar, let me make 2 announcements. At first is that we will collect all your questions via the Q&A button or the chat box, both available to you in the Zoom user toolbar just below your screen. Second, please note that this webinar is being recorded and you will receive the link of the podcast later today. So I have an honor and a great pleasure also to introduce my 2 guests, Yann Francoise and Thomas Levaux, both living in Paris, the city where life will always be la vie en rose. So without further delay, let me bring and invite to this virtual stage my first guest, Yann Francoise of Bienvenue. Welcome to this webinar. Yann Francoise is a leader of Paris Climate Action Plan, gathering commitments and actions of all Paris community from citizens to companies. And for your knowledge, Yann Francoise was responsible for launching the very first climate bond, 300 million euros in the city of Paris in 2015. Not to end up the impressive curricula that Yann Francoise has, he represents the city of Paris at technical level at Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, as well as Cities 40 and other international organizations. So Yann Francoise, it's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. It's a very pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation, Tabaré.
It's our honor. So tell me, Yann Francoise, I understand you will give us a quick panorama over the Paris Climate Action Plan. But before we start, there's a question that I would like to ask to you, and relates to this particular picture. Ici demain ensemble pour le climat. What does that mean? Why we have this on the screen at the moment?
Yeah, thank you for this. It's the logo of the new climate action plan adopted by City Council of Paris in 2018. for non-French speaker, it means that now and tomorrow we have to add together. Together is very important for us because we never adopted a climate action plan in the city of Paris without all the stakeholders of the city, citizens, NGO, companies, scientists. It's important to gather everyone to achieve the Paris Agreement, but also to achieve all the local action. It's not only a decision from the city for the city, it's a decision from everyone for everyone.
Perfect. That's cool. All right. So, Jean-Francois, thanks for that. Let's start with your presentation. The floor is totally yours.
Thank you. So I work for the city of Paris. City of Paris, it's maybe one of the smallest capitals worldwide, but one of the densest. We have currently more than 20,000 inhabitants per square kilometers, and the region around the city of Paris gathers 12 million inhabitants. Next slide, please. City of Paris adopted its first climate action plan in 2007. It has been adopted in 2012 with the same commitment to try to decrease by 25% the GHG emissions balance of the city in quite 16 years. And of course, to have the first steps to adapt the city of Paris to the next climate change futures. Maybe one click, please. And in 2018, the Paris City Council, after 18 months of collaboration with all the stakeholders, as already said, adopted the new climate action plan, the third one, to achieve the Paris Agreement and to try to define what does it mean to become a carbon city by 2050. But one of the mottos is very important, is not only to be carbon neutral with zero local emission, is also to build a new, fairer and more inclusive city. We don't want to leave anyone behind the line of carbon neutrality. Next slide, please. But to deal with that, we have to understand what does it mean to become carbon neutral for a city, for a small territory. It's quite maybe easier to design that in the Paris Agreement. We try to mitigate the CO2 emission from the planet, and maybe we hope that ocean, CO2 capture, and forest, we do the job. But what does it mean when you have a territory of 100 square kilometers? So we try to design it. What does it mean if you deal with local emission, global emission? Of course, since we work, it was the beginning in 2016. Now we work with other standards, with other networks like C40 and CNCA. And if you have a click, you can see that now we have edited with some other cities a carbon neutral protocol to define that. But if we have a look to the next slide of the carbon footprint of the city of Paris, we edited last January in 2020, we assessed classically the inventory of the city of Paris, CO2 emission of city of Paris, gathering data from the ground, from the companies, from the government, from the administration, all the statistic bureau we can have. And we assess that the Paris carbon footprint now represented around 22 million ton CO2 equivalent. CO2 equivalent, because we assess all the CO2, the ZJ emission gases, CH4, N2O, and so on. And if I have a look on this balance, maybe you are not get used about that, but you can see that the two first sectors is not residential, is not road transportation, is flight and food consumption, because since the beginning of our history in 2004, in Paris, we tried to assess all the GHG emissions generated by all the activities of Parisians, of companies, of government administration, wherever they are emitted. So we take account, for example, all the flights taken by the Parisian for leisure or business every year. Of course, this month is very low, but in classic year, you can see it's a third of the balance. And we assess for the same way the food consumed by the citizens. You know, cooking is very important for us, but we have to live every day and we have to eat every day. Even if we don't have agricultural feed, we are responsible of GHG emissions generated by agriculture, most of them in France, but sometimes far away from France. And if you have a look of the rest, you have maybe a light gray you can see under the different logo. It means that it's a direct emission, local emission from direct territory. is, of course, all the buildings from residential, commercial, industry, and so on, all the energy consumed by those buildings, but also energy consumed by the transportation in Paris and the management of the waste. But if we can have a look on the next slide, it will be far easier. We can see that wherever you are, from the beginning of our story, the first year is 2004, and the last one is, of course, 2050. There is a mistake on the slide. The first year, you can see that the local emissions, the direct emission from the territory, is quite a fourth of the global carbon footprint of the Paris carbon footprint. A fourth, quite the last 10 years. And now you have our last results. We assess that in 2018, we decreased by 20% thanks to Paris policy, but also all the private actions of the stakeholders, from, of course, some decision from national level and European level, of course. We assess to decrease by 20% the carbon footprint of city of Paris and the local emission by 25. It's a very, very good result for us. It's very impressive. When we began in 2004, we are not so hopeful, but it's a very important step. Now, to go further, I would like to explain how to become carbon neutral. If we can put the next slide, you have the trend here for 2050, the pathway, but it's not only technical plans that we did before. For example, we did a lot of action to reduce the price of the cars in the city, to improve the energy efficiency everywhere. And if you look at this slide, all the sectors in light gray, it's a classical sector you can find in the climate action plan everywhere, technical actions. But if you want to become carbon neutral, you have to change the government. You have to act with everybody. Because if we look at the balance of the city of Paris we saw before, Mayor of Paris, even if she currently very, very involved to tackle climate change issue, she can act only on 25% of the balance by her own decisions, on own influence and power she has. The rest depends on the national decisions, private decisions from the citizens and all the company. It's why we have to reinvent the governments, and for that we decided to create a new assembly gathering everyone to decide the main action every year to implement, but also a new way of finance it, because we can, of course, pay for everything and everyone. And as everywhere, public money is rare, so it's why you have the topics on finance and offsetting, and of course, a topic of advocacy to change maybe sometimes the law at national level or regional level or sometimes European level. And now we have a very, very strong part to improve the quality of life, of well-being, and of course, air and adaptation part. But I won't go, of course, into the details. I would like to finish by some example how to make some focus and a combination between measurement, direct measurement, and CO2 emission. Because I present the figures of the last results of our balance, but to create such an inventory, I need 18 months, quite 6 and 9 months to assess the data, to collect the data everywhere, to respect the privacy of the data, of course, and the confidentiality of some data. But after that, I have to transform the data, to analyze and to compare the data. So we need sometimes 1 year, 18 months to create a balance of 1 year. So it's very hard to have the data for every mayor every year. And if we look at the next slide, for example, one of the main challenges for the city of Paris for the next 30 years is to retrofit 1 million existing flights. 1 million existing flights. It's a wonderful challenge for the workers, for the builders, but it's very hard challenge. We don't have, for the moment, enough money to do that. We have to decide every private owners. It's a 1 million private flights. And in the current law, Mayor of Paris have no right to impose to a private owner to retrofit their flat. So we have to find another way. But if we want to assess if it works or not, our own policy, we need direct measure or better inventory, high resolutions data at each buildings to know if it works or not. And it will be very, very useful, but also to know if we maintain this performance in the next year. You do know when we create an eco-district, we hope that we have wonderful new high energy efficiency performance buildings. And it's very easy in the paper. And we can find wonderful architects, buildings, and builders to do that. But if you compare what you expected to the real data 2 years or 3 years or 5 years after the use of the buildings, usually you see that there is a drift. And sometimes the drift is only maybe 20%, but we have also assessed that in some eco-district, wonderful eco-district, the drift is 200%, because sometimes we forgot to explain to people how to manage buildings, because these new buildings is new use, and we have to explain, and we have to not control behavior, but to accompany behavior, and to make the performance a way of life of the building, but also the citizens or the companies who live in. That's what is very important, to connect to real data every year or every month, for example. Another example is about mobility. Maybe you have heard in the next slide that for the new climate action plan, the mayor of Paris and the city council decided to ban diesel car by 2024 and benzene car by 2030. It's a very, very huge decision, but thanks to that, and if we are lucky to shift to green energy for those trucks and cars that left in Paris, that will live in Paris, maybe we can assess and achieve carbon neutrality. But with such important policy, we need to know quite every day if we are on the good way or not. And it's very, very difficult to assess. When you, for example, we decided to have a low emission zones, but we have to control each car to know the category of the car, the performance of the car, to make the inventory. And for my job, to gather all the data to create this inventory is very, very hard. It's very, very long play. If we can connect to direct measures that we did for air quality polluters, for example, we can win time, we can help decision makers to improve that. That's the main challenge for us for the next year, but of course, we have also to improve. It's not only to shift to green energy, it's also to reduce the traffic, and especially to reduce the traffic of the logistics, not only on people, but logistics is the main challenge for all the, I think, dense city. And the last slide is to compare why we need to, not maybe to have a comeback versus ton CO2 emission versus PPM, but I don't know for other colleagues from city, but sometimes to explain what does it mean to citizens, but also to elected people, what does it mean CO2 ton emission? It's not so easy. So first, you have to explain that there is a CO2, you have CH4, you have N2O and SFCs and so on. But also, what does it mean? 1 ton of CO2 emission a year in your daily life. So now try to imagine how I have to explain what does it mean, a PPM, to my decision makers. They know now that city of Paris represents 22 million of CO2 emission. Tomorrow I have to say that, oh, next winter, maybe it's 800 ppm, and next summer, 500 ppm. Oh yeah, in 1 year, I reduce by 50%. So I have to explain, and it's why it's very important to connect also to real-time measure. If you look at this slide, it shows a trend to 2050 that we have to respect. And finally, we can say that we can give to different sectors the carbon budget of what they have the authorization to emit. Like, for example, Tokyo did with the cap and trade system for the tertiary buildings. And if you want to control every year, every month, this performance, if you can connect your inventory emission to the real-time measure, you win time. You win time of decision, you win time of money, and you can see the slope of the trend has to be faster and faster than before. So we need to have very, very quick decision for that, and to be sure that we invest in the right thing, in the right moment currently. And it will be very, very important after the crisis we live currently, because currently a lot of people want to relaunch the economy, but sometimes we launch with a fossil way of thinking and not the green way of thinking for the economy. I stop here. I don't know if you have respect my time, Tabaré. But
no, you're doing great, and actually, I think you have concluded in a very inspiring way, because indeed we are living a very difficult time. I personally hope everyone is at home safe and healthy, and you're keeping the safety distance to prevent the expansion of this global pandemic. So that brings me back to one of your slides in which you mentioned about the key initiatives that Paris is embracing, and the first shot I saw was that one related to quality of life. And that's when this question probably comes very relevant. So what's this relationship between COVID-19 and the Paris CO2 emissions? We have these questions in our second webinar on multi-hazards adaptation, as well as in our first webinar on clean air quality for cities. And I think this is something important that probably our audience would like to know. So what is this relation between COVID-19 and the Paris CO2 emissions?
The first thing, as everywhere, the COVID-19 consequences for Paris, that it's a lockdown for all the city. We decrease a lot of part of commercial activities, and a lot of workers are stay at home. And so we try to assess what does it mean. But the first thing that we have to think that, you know, it doesn't mean that it's the world that we want tomorrow. We don't want to live every year with the COVID-19 to be sure that we can achieve Paris Agreement. No, it's not that we want. We want to live in the world carbon neutral, but with everybody outside and not everybody inside their house. But we try to assess with the data we collected currently. And as I said in the first or third slide, the first topic of our carbon footprint is flights. And of course, there is no more flights currently. So it's easy to assess. We have the data from the two airports around Paris, and we have 95% less passengers than usually. And it means that Parisian doesn't take it anymore, any flight. But if we look at the trend of 2050, it's only the double. So if we want to achieve Paris Agreement for us in 2050 about passenger flights, we have to think another way to go for the leisure, or have another way for flights to have a very carbon efficiency performance, because it's impossible to say that, no, we want to reduce the traffic by 90%. That's very important. Another thing, if you can click, maybe we have the data about the road freight. We have a decrease by 50% of the traffic from the goods currently in Paris, because we have no more commercial activity within Paris boundaries. But it's quite the same figure that we have to achieve by 2050. So it means that if we want to become carbon neutral by 2050, one choice, you decrease the economic activity by 50%. That's not our goal for the moment. But we have to think that to recreate a local goods activities around the city of Paris, to be sure that we can provide all the goods, materials, closer than currently, and to decrease the impact, because on the orange part, you are on the carbon footprint. So it means that GHG emission generated outside the city, so sometimes far away. If we can make the goods closer, you will decrease this impact, and not obligatory to decrease by 50% the economic activity. If we look at the local emission, for the next click, please, I made an example about the tertiary or the commercial. We reduce, of course, all the activity, and we have quite the same figures than the objective of 2030. So it means that it's very easy. Of course, we won't close the shops by 40%, but we have to improve the energy efficiency of all the commercials by 40% for the next 10 years. We have 10 years to improve by 40% the energy efficiency of those buildings, or maybe to shift to renewable energy compared to not coal energy, because we have no more coal electricity quite in France, but no more oil fuel, no more diesel for some buildings and so on, and less natural gas in our buildings, and to shift maybe to district heating or to renewable energy. That's one of the main challenges. So this, finally, this crisis shows us not the way we have to go, but some very important example of the consequences we have to do in next 10 years or next 30 years, and the gaps we have to bridge.
Thanks, Yann. And this is very fascinating data. I think it reveals very well that idea of, well, how consumption-based emissions are so important for Paris citizens in that aim of reaching neutrality by 2050. I understand correctly, this is some data that this is still under revision, correct?
Yeah,
perfect.
I didn't publish any figures. It's only to help people to understand the consequences of the crisis and to help the people to understand what we have to manage for the future. So please don't disseminate it everywhere.
Oh, that's such a pity, because we have at the moment 97 people watching at this slide.
Yeah, but
all right, Yann.
Yann.
Thank you very much for this. Now I think it's the good moment to connect to our next presentation. Thomas Levon, research scientist at the Environment and Climate Science Laboratory. He's currently a co-investigator on the first research effort to quantify greenhouse gas emissions from urban areas. We will talk about that a bit later. And this is in support of mitigation policy over large metropolitan areas, a topic that clearly connects to what Yann has kindly been explaining over the past minutes. So Thomas Levon, bienvenue, welcome. It's a great pleasure to have you in here. Let me ask you something. I understand correctly that today we're talking about atmospheric monitoring on and of urban greenhouse gas emissions. But I feel you have a particular story to tell us on how urban CO2 emissions might be underestimated, something like that. Let me know.
Yes.
So please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, that's right. So I just want to talk about it because I think it's a very complicated story for a city to come up with a city budget. And measuring city emissions, as you just saw from Yann Francoise, takes a lot of resources and a lot of time and efforts. Paris has an entire service dedicated to that mission. They've teamed up with the Air Quality Agency, and they've been working on that topic for years to come up with good and accurate numbers. So what I'd like to show you is what the status of that, especially in the US, where I've been working a lot. So the typical problem for a city is the choice of the protocol. When you build that inventory, you need to go for one methodology. And it depends on which emission factors you're going to use to convert your energy into a CO2 emission number. It depends on the scope. Some cities are going for scope 1, some do what is called community emissions. So you include the scope 2 and the scope 1, or some flavors of it. Some cities report the scope 3. It totally depends on, and sometimes it's a political decision, sometimes it's because of your governance. You have control only of part of the city. Like a city like Paris has huge suburbs, so you need also to consider these suburban areas. The data access is a problem, depending on the country where you live, depending on the rules and the infrastructure that has been collecting information or not. And then the geographical area. As I said, you can have a county scale, a city scale, a regional scale. It's very complicated for that. So different cities may disagree on that. And then the time lag. This to me has been the most difficult part. If you want to collect information, as Yann was showing, he's showing you very recent numbers, but the official inventory coming out is often 2-3 years, sometimes 5 years behind real time. So for a policymaker, for local government, it's really complicated to actually put in place a policy when you have numbers that are 4 or 5 years old. So there has been significant progress, and I don't want to be all negative because it's not true. There are a lot of international consortiums that have been really on rising and growing. I could talk about the Covenant of Mayors, the C40 City Group, the ICEA, or the CDP. All these groups have been gathering a lot of local governments, have tried to put very clear protocols out. They're trying to actually make numbers comparable. Unfortunately, it's sometimes not even possible. So they're trying hard, and it's going. So it's not like nothing has been done. Far from that. Cities are very proactive on these topics. But now we would like more timely and more comparable estimates to be more. So on the next slide, please, Tabaré, thank you. I'm going to show you a product. This is not the typical one that we're talking about. It's actually a gridded national scale inventory. This comes from a research group in Northern Arizona University in the US. Kevin Gurney and his collaborators have put together a complete map of the US where he mapped the CO2 emissions at a very high resolution. It's not a building scale, but it's as close as can be for each sector of the industry. They make sure that the national total would match the local scales or the state scale. They take all the electricity production area, etc. So they map that with different techniques on typical GIS software. It's spatially and temporally resolved. So he has profiles for traffic counts and etc. And it's a unique collection of activity data because it's a lot of work. If you need to get all that data set, dig into it, find the inconsistencies, and convert that into a CO2 emission number. So what he did was very simple. He then cropped all the cities as they defined their own borders, and he compared his numbers to all the cities across the US. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you the map for 50 cities that have reported their emissions on a self-reported inventory. You can see that clearly there is this difference, and sometimes really large, up to 50 or 100% for some of the cities. You can see how it varies from city to city. And you can see how some of the major cities have also some disagreements sometimes on this. So with all that information done, we wanted to know what is the typical error for a city reporting that number. So on the next slide, I show you a more detailed. So now you can see from the negative to the positive. On average, cities report about 20% less than Volcan, than this product.
Quite a lot,
some of this, yeah, it's a lot. Some of the cities seems, so we had to put everything back on the scope 1. So we removed the indirect, the energy, the CO2 emissions linked to energy production that they bought. We have to do that because if a city has the power plant inside its city limits, it will be counted as direct emissions from the city. So it's kind of unfair. If you compare Chicago to New York and one of the cities has the power plant within the city limit, then one city will look enormous and not the other. So they typically work on the scope 2, which makes total sense. For our purpose, we want to be on scope 1 because scope 2 had a lot of problems. Some cities were reporting in different ways using different emission factors. So now when you look at the details, and then you can see this red bar, the red bars represent the typical difference among sectors. And you can see that some of the cities that look like they agree, for example, the cities in the middle of the plot where the black bars are very small, you can see that they hide sometimes huge discrepancies at the sectoral level. So you could have an error of 100% at the sector distribution, but because you were too high in the traffic and too low in the residential, you end up about right. So we wanted really to highlight which cities seem to be right, but actually for the wrong reasons. So overall, we kind of looked more deeply, and Kevin went into the details of why these mismatches. Technically, a lot of cities omit the petroleum fuel use and the point source emissions from the industry sectors. It's not because they don't want to include them, it's because it's very difficult to get that information. Industries don't share openly all their data, and the petroleum is actually divided into a lot of small companies, fuel providers, fuel distributors. So it's very difficult to dig into that. The second thing is how you treat your marine shipping and the airborne emissions. Typical stories is the harbor is not within your city limit. So Baltimore, for example, excluded all the ships coming in the city. Or some people decided that the airport is not their responsibility. For example, if you have an international airport next to your city, it's a lot of emissions. So do we count them or not? Well, maybe not because it's not our fault. So some cities have excluded the international flights from their total. And finally, how do you account for your on-road emissions? It's very interesting because the on-road is a complicated thing. We have a lot of good accountability for the traffic counts, but it's very hard for us to sometimes get the emission factors right. So different people have used different methodologies to get their on-road emissions. So we found that these were the 3 main sources of disagreement among these different city inventories. So on the next slide, please, thank you. So finally, we were trying to find what do we really need? We would need to first define stricter protocols. It's clear that when we collect activity data and we collect energy use data, it's difficult. Every city has its limitation. They don't have access to the data sometimes. So this has to be maybe not at the national scale, but it had to have a framework for cities to get access to this activity data. Otherwise, it takes years to contact every single point source you have on your map. Get into the database. What emission factors should I apply to that industry? So this is really a lot of work that we need to solve for the cities. We also need to be consistent between different levels. If you look at how the local levels have dealt with their emission factors, it's sometimes not consistent with the state level. So when you're trying to put that all together, it makes a mess. The local emissions have counted some, the state has removed some, they use different factors. So you cannot even re-aggregate these numbers together. And we need to provide more timely emissions estimate because as Yann Francoise was saying, he needs to go and talk to people. He needs to know and make them move. But if you have no recent numbers, if you don't have feedbacks on their very aggressive climate policy, then the next government will get elected and you will never see the results of your own actions. So it's very hard to get a very flexible and dynamic environment when you don't have numbers to provide. So here comes the idea of IGIS, which is bringing in the game some more timely and independent source of information. So the atmospheric monitoring. So on the next slide, I want to show you how it works and just the big principles, just for all of you to have an idea. If I want to make the simplest comparison of all, I would say it's exactly like air quality. When you measure air quality in your city, you have sensors across town telling you if the air is actually clean or not. At the same time, we also measure the cars one by one. We have car inspection because we want to act on it. So you need the bottom up, the car inspection, and you also need the top down to actually make sure that your total matches up. So we do the same thing with CO2. We start with a very fancy product. Air Paris is doing that for Paris area, Origin or Suez. Other companies are also doing that now. So you have a map, very detailed, building level, where you try to get all the information on your CO2 emissions. You couple that to an atmospheric model, and we simulate how the CO2 is going to diffuse and disperse in the air, and we get simulations of CO2. We have a network of towers, and we compare the two. If your network of towers says you have too much CO2, we're going to decrease the inventory. Not enough, we're going to increase it. So this is the idea behind the monitoring of CO2. It's basically a propagation of the inventories into the atmosphere. So on the next slide, please. Thanks, Tabaré. So I'm going to show you a project. It's Indianapolis. I'm not going to tell you why Indianapolis because it's too long, but
well, that's something that we might cover in the questions because now I'm feeling an interesting story there.
Yeah, maybe I may tell you. So we started there with a network of towers, and you can see the idea behind it. Indianapolis is a town in the Midwest of United States of America. It's a very flat and spread city. There is no major downtown like New York City or Paris. So it's more spread out. You see the beltway around the city. So we had these towers deployed all around it to capture the upwind and downwind flow of air. Indianapolis is not a huge city. Globally, it's in the top 300, maybe something like that. Within the US, it's in the top 40 or 30. So it's not a small city either. Most cities in the world look like Indianapolis. They don't look like Paris. Paris is a mega city, as we call them. So this is kind of, for us, a very median city case where if we want to have an impact on these CO2 inventories, we need to make sure that we can also do Indianapolis. And not only Paris or Los Angeles. So we have that project going. So let me go the next slide, please, Tabaré. Thank you. So here is what I did. I split it in two sectors. One was the combustion engine, so traffic and on-road emissions. Why did I do that? Because these sectors emit a lot of carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. So by using these two gases, I can tell if it's more related to traffic or more related to another sector. And on the other hand, we have all the other sectors, residential, industrial, etc., put together as tagged low CO2 sectors. So they emit little carbon monoxide compared to carbon dioxide. You can see the maps. You can see the highways are very clear on the right panel, whereas the other one correspond more to a building type inventory. So on the next slide, please. So when we do that, I show you here 3 years of emissions over Indianapolis. The blue panel shows you on the left, shows you the traffic. There is no seasonality in traffic. Whatever happens, people have to go to work, they drive in winter, in the summer, all the time. So you see it's very flat. And the two estimates, one from the atmosphere and one from this building level product, is really in agreement within few percent. The second panel, so underneath that, you can see now the strong seasonality is because we are looking now at the residential, the commercial. So when it's cold, you turn on the heat and you burn more carbon, more fuel than you would do in the summer. You can see a little peak in the summertime, actually. This is the air conditioning system in the United States. When the heat waves pop in July, people turn on the air conditioning and the power plant is actually producing energy again. So you have some sort of a double seasonality in that. But anyway, you can barely see the two lines because they agree pretty well on that level. You can see on the maps how the system may optimize some of the areas, saying it's too high or saying it's too low. You can see the distribution around the city. So we get some information locally into where these disagreements take place. So the inventories may have underestimated a point source, may have overestimated the highway. So we can help correct the inventory because let's be clear, I'm not here to provide another number for the city governments. I'm here to help them build a better inventory. That's really the goal here. So we are an information system, not at all a way to evaluate or police the inventory people, not at all. So on the next panel, I'm just showing you what is achieved, thank you. And you can see over time, we start with a number and a very large error bar. And as we go over time, over 5 days, a month, a year, and then 3 years, we improve our uncertainty is decreasing a lot. We think it's wonderful. Well, we have to be wonderful because if you look at the changes from Yann Francoise' climate action plan, if you decrease in 2030 to 50%, it's about 3 or 4% decrease a year. It's a small change. It's a very small change on an annual basis. So if we have to reach that very high level of accuracy, if we want to inform the city every year, so we really need to do that very accurate job. I'm showing you here a convergence between two products. We might be both wrong, but this is the first point. We seem to agree between the atmosphere and the inventory. For us, it's a very first step into getting a better information system to policymakers. So on the next slide, please. Right. Okay, so now what does it mean? If I take the self-reported inventory of the city of Indianapolis, you can see these numbers in blue. We have a number for 2010, 2013, and 2016. They do it only every 3 years. The most recent one is 2016, an example of what it means to have this delay for Indianapolis. So the mayor right now has to work with numbers from 2016. When you compare with what we have found with Hestia in black and the atmosphere in red, you see that we have a systematic 35% underestimation for Indianapolis. Now, it seems like with the atmospheric system and Hestia, we get to a close agreement. So maybe now we might be able to reach now a more confidence in that number for the city and potentially a more timely estimate to take actions at the local level. So this is the sort of analysis I want to show you that could really help cities to refine their inventories, help them get the data they sometimes don't have the time to collect, and provide better information for them to make decisions. So on the next slide. Thank you. I want to show you what it means near real time. We've done that project a long time ago. Now it's been 7 years, I think. This was a real-time monitoring of the Davos emission. Davos is in Switzerland. It's a little ski resort, a beautiful place in the middle of the Alps. They have every year this World Economic Forum. We had coupled instruments monitoring the city emissions. I'm showing you the WEF period. It's really interesting because during the meeting, because of security reasons, they shut down the entire city. People leave town, all the public infrastructure is stopped, the schools are stopped, everything is stopped. And we were able to monitor real-time daily how the forum completely shut down the emissions. This was in the middle of winter, and I show you in black what we call heating degree days. So how much degrees you need to get to warm up your house. You can see the cold wave coming right after the meeting when people came back, and suddenly the emissions exploded because it was extremely cold at that time of year. And we saw the emissions rising by 150% compared to a winter average for that time period. So it shows the potential to detect even a weekly event on a city like Davos, a small town in the middle of the Alps, and show to people their impact on the local emissions. So going from there, we are now starting to dig into the Paris confinement episode. I've seen Jing Huilian, who is part of the participant list, and she's right now running the model for that case. This is an example of the data we collected over Paris. There is a set of instruments running right now over Paris, about 7, collecting everyday data for us on carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, on methane. And we look at the differences across towers. A tower outside Paris should have less CO2 than a tower within the city limits. And you can see that, yes, these different towers have very different signatures in the atmosphere. And you can see how after the lockdown period, this gradient absolutely disappeared from the network. So we have a significant decrease, which seems to match very well what Yann-Francoise was describing in the decrease in the emissions in the area of Paris. So we are right now comparing our numbers, seeing if they match what Yann-Francoise has been able to collect from the most recent data set. And we hope that we can actually reconcile it and write a nice story about that in the near future. But this shows you how these networks have a really fast response time and can detect these changes. For us, let's be honest, we know that the city has decreased its emissions. There is no car in Paris. There is no surprise in that. What we want to test is the accuracy of the system. Can we reconcile the real-time information that Yann-Francoise has in its hand, the atmospheric data information that we can add to it, and come up with a very timely information for Paris to see the impact of the confinement? So on the last slide, so I just wanted to thank you for your attention and some of the sponsors that have been funding these research over time. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Thomas. Wow, I think it's kind of mind-blowing what you just presented. I take as a note that I will not dare to make a summary, but just say a very important statement. We have to be wonderful. I will even dare to say that we cannot afford not being wonderful. And from Yann-Francoise's presentation, well, I think he was very, very clear. Real-time measurements to precise, and we need to foster local action based on that real data. I guess those are very important messages, and how relevant this is for many cities of the world. I think we have a lot of questions now. Let me open. We're getting into the final race of our webinar. So I think we have I actually have seen a couple of questions that have been answered. So that's fantastic. So let me just review a couple of one, and I think I have one in here. So for Paris, have you managed to shape change regulations at national, regional level that may hinder your plans? So I think this is a question from Yann-Francoise. Is there any shape or change of regulations based on this more updated data?
Yeah, thank you for all the questions. I tried to answer some during the Thomas presentation. But for the last one about regulation, it's why I said that in the last plan we have now a part about advocacy. As I said, we can act alone, and sometimes you have, of course, as you said, some barriers from national level, sometimes for us from European level, and we have to try to unlock them. And sometimes it's not because the state doesn't want. Is maybe because we are not on the same rhythm. Of course, when you manage a city, we are more flexible, and we can test sometimes some decision, and we can implement, and to have some experimentation, and maybe after 5 or 6 years, it will be positive. We can influence the national law. It was the case, for example, on how you said the thermal regulation law for buildings, for retrofitting and for creating new buildings. In France, it's a national law available for anywhere, any cities, any rural countries, and so on. But if you decided that on small area we want to test a new regulation, you can decide it, but not on all the territory. So we decided that 10% with the first climate action plan in 2007 will be laboratory of Paris climate action plan with new regulation to be better than 75%. That's the national one. And finally, it works. Of course, at the beginning, for the builders, it was not so easy, and we launched some innovation, and we invest in research and development with public money to launch innovation. But now, if we look at the national regulation law, it will be quite the same as the Paris one 10 years ago. So we influence the national law. So it's a deal sometimes, and sometimes we go to the court. It's not the good part, but it's why we have politicians, we have deputies, we have parliament in the city of Paris to influence the state when we don't have. And you have seen maybe Mayor Hidalgo with other mayor in Madrid and Brussels decided to sue the European Commission for the decision on air quality motors standards. So we want to avoid that. And we prefer to act directly and to change the law, but sometimes we have to go further.
Thank you very much, Jean-Francois. Thomas, I have a question for you. This one goes, I would just read it the way it has been written. How demanding was the Indianapolis project in terms of number of sensors and similar devices? Do you think you could do it in a larger scale, say hundreds of cities, or it is not the intention of the project?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's enormous. Let's be clear. It's about 10 years of research involving maybe 15 research groups. It's an investment in millions of dollars. So it is not scalable. Let's be clear. For Paris, what we started to do, and where the solution we would like to make it scalable, is to develop low-cost sensor technology. And we are right now testing them. They're affordable sensors. We partner with the city of Paris to find places to deploy them. So we lower cost on the infrastructure. And we are trying to make software more automatic and get a workforce that will be able to actually apply to other cities. So we are working on that right now. For Indianapolis, we cannot reproduce it because a single sensor is $50,000. So when you have to deploy 15 of them, spend 10 years of research or money on that, it's very difficult. Now the technology is moving really fast. We know an instrument cost can be divided by 10 in a matter of 10 years. So we're very hopeful that these technologies are at the early stage. We have the early users, and Paris has really signed now to be an early user and develop and help the development of these methods. But that's highly relevant. Yes, good question.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Yann, Francois, what will be the post-COVID-19 situation air quality for the whole world?
I don't know for the whole world. First, because I'm not the specialist of air quality in Paris. I'm the specialist of CO2 emissions and GHG emissions. Of course, I have some knowledge about air quality, and I hope that after the crisis, maybe we can shift and improve the air quality. But even if the car will come back on next Monday for Paris, the unlock will begin next Monday. But we hope that people now, as they may be scared to take public transportation, they won't take the car but the bike. But it's a huge challenge to make people confident to come back to public transportation and to respect all the measure. I don't know for the world. What I have a hope and I have a fear. The first fear is maybe after the different war, you have we say the crazy years that everybody want to flight again and so on, and sometimes you can have a very big drift. And if you go back to fossil fuel, and for example the oil is very cheaper currently, and to coal economy, it will be a big disaster. If we have written no lessons of that, it will be the same. But I hope that we can come back with maybe a more green economy and have more new ideas, because now people are maybe more aware of the consequences. When you touch your environment, you can touch to your health, and you can touch at the end finally to your job and to your economy. So maybe we can have more supporters than before. But I'm not, I don't know, maybe no crystal ball.
So what you're saying is that you don't have that crystal ball that will tell us what the future looks like, but maybe Thomas, with all the measures that you are doing in Paris, in Davos, Indianapolis, what's your idea? How is the future looking for these cities after COVID-19?
Great question. I know even less than Yann. The only thing I can say, we are looking right now at the link between air quality and CO2. For a long time, these two communities have not been talking to each other. And it's very understandable, because when you work in air quality, you worry about human health at the street level. When you work on carbon cycle, you worry about a 30-year timeline over the globe. So we were coming from different worlds. But now that we are both working on cities and trying to improve the condition, we know that there are a lot of co-benefits. We know that by reducing traffic, we help reducing NOx, we help improve air quality on a daily basis. So we are trying now really hard to get these two communities together and make sure that we provide the tools for again, the policymakers to see what are the co-benefits, where are they, and how they can improve both problems at the same time. It also lowers the cost, let's be honest. This is the reality of it. If you can both tackle air quality and carbon at the same time, everybody will sign for it, I'm hoping. So we're trying to provide that information. It's not there yet, but we're working on it.
Perfect, Thomas. Yann, thanks very much for your comments. We have many other questions coming over. Unfortunately, we won't be able to address them all. I see some greetings to you, Yann Francoise. I also see a lot of acknowledgements to you, Thomas. So I guess that the audience is pretty happy and pretty interested on everything that you have just said. I would just like to move to the ending part of this webinar, not without reading a comment that to me is very inspiring. It says, well, actually, it quotes you back again, Thomas. Let's be wonderful together when we can distribute data to the local decision makers. And I will dare to try to answer this one. Well, I'm not sure when we can distribute data to decision makers, but something that you can really distribute to them is the learnings of this webinar series. As you know, the World Meteorological Organization together with WF Cities, we have organized this 3 sessions of webinars. The first one took place last Monday, Cleaner Air in Cities. We reviewed the case of Mexico City, all the measurements that we're doing here in Mexico City, and how the horizon for the near future is looking forward, how people is participating in the transformation of the data and understanding of better very figures, better numbers to act better in terms of climate change. On Wednesday, we have another very fascinating webinar. This one was on multi-hazard adaptation in cities. We reviewed the case of Hong Kong, pretty similar learnings, the importance of having real data to have a transformational impact on the ground. So very fascinating webinar. And finally, well, I will not dare to summarize what has been here. We have discussed about monitoring, modeling, and very important lessons learned, how relevant it is not only to rely, and I think this is my personal conclusion, how important it is not only to have your GHG inventories right in place, but also to validate it somehow with accurate on-site real-time information when possible. So all these 3 webinars have been marvelously organized by the World Meteorological Organization with the support of WWF Cities. So these webinars have been recorded, so if you want to have a look at them, please just let us know, and we will be happy to send you the links. So I guess this is the end of our webinar. I need to thank once again to Yann Francoise and Thomas Lebeau for this marvelous presentation, and also to thank again to the World Meteorological Organization, to my dear colleague Mario Peroespi, who has been fundamental. We have been working for this since long time. Actually, I will dare to say that this is one of the fascinating results of the Climate Action Week in Latin America. It was thanks to the secretariat that put together somehow the World Meteorological Organization with WWF in a cities-related event, when we start thinking, oh, well, maybe we should have a series of webinars related to science, policymaking in cities in terms of air quality, air pollution, CO2 control, etc. So I think this is the result. So thanks very much to everyone that has been for over a year working on this series of webinar. You have on screen our contact details. If you have any further question, well, please let us know about it. And well, I think that's it. I cannot end up without saying that the webinar is over. You may all go in peace. Thank you very much, and stay tuned for the next webinars. Thank you. My name is Tabaré, Arroyo, Currás. Ciao, ciao.
Well, the One Planet City Challenge is basically a challenge to see cities move beyond what they're already doing to address climate change and to go even further. In that process, we want to support what they're doing, but we really want to challenge them to move farther. It's also a challenge among cities to really incentivize a friendly competition for cities to outgreen each other, to really show what they're doing. And then thirdly, it is a challenge to reward the cities that are really doing, implementing holistic and far-reaching climate action plans, both nationally but also internationally.
The urgency of tackling climate change is such that any possible way of learning and sharing information and benefiting from the experiences of others become important.
Cities are encouraged to join to transparently report their emissions within this carbon climate registry. And that shows that they are demonstrating their own emissions and that they really want to move forward in creating climate action and change.
The chemistry, if you like, of a winning profile would be one that stands out in terms of precisely that mixture between ambition to make a real difference over a time frame that is realistic, and it's backed up and supported by an evidence base. You can't do this unilaterally governing from the City Hall. It has to be undertaken through partnerships with different stakeholders.
The 2017-2018 One Planet City Challenge will have a unique focus on mobility. And mobility is, for me, a very exciting thing because it influences the scale of a city, the livability of a city. Every time I hop on my bicycle, I'm interacting with my city. And if I'm going to be biking from point A to point B in a city, then that city has to be planned at the human scale.
The benefits to cities of participation are, on the one hand, getting publicity for the work that they do, both domestically and internationally, and on the other hand, getting validation of some of the innovative and ambitious progress that they wish to make and can provide evidence of beginning to make.
I think the major positive consequence of participating in that challenge is that we have an ability with WWF to spread widely that idea of we have to act all together to tackle climate change.
We try to steal good ideas as much as we can, of course. So that's why we like competitions like this, because that gives us a possibility to see what other municipalities do.
We know really good examples are out there, and we are keen to see those cities share what they're doing, and we want to help get their messages across to a wider audience.